When engagement drops off, in our experience, arrears rarely resolve themselves. We think that landlords should move from informal chasing to legal action once it becomes clear that obviously the tenant is not really engaging or making meaningful payments.
Ultimately, if you can't secure the arrears or the possession at the end of the day by discussing things with your tenant, then you need to pursue formally.
I think the key is having a clear strategy rather than reacting sporadically.
What happens when tenants don't pay? Missed rent can throw off cash flow, impact returns, and create uncertainty for property owners. Whether you're a landlord or thinking about investing in UK real estate, understanding these rules is essential to protecting your investments. Today, we will look into practical strategies, legal options, and key things to consider with guidance from two legal experts. I'm joined by Antonia Manti from Consulco's legal team, who advises international property owners and investors. And we have Emily Wood, who is a UK-based real estate dispute resolution lawyer from DMH Stallard, specializing in landlord and tenant matters. Antonia, I'm going to start with you right away. Rent arrears are becoming more and more common. Antonia, from your experience, what are the main reasons that landlords are facing arrears today? And when should they move from informal chasing to legal action?
At Consulco, we're seeing arrears increase mainly due to cash flow pressure on tenants, like higher interest rates, inflation, reduced consumer spending, and then in some sectors, potentially a slower post-COVID recovery. I think in commercial property especially, some tenants tend to prioritize other liabilities over rent. We think that landlords should move from informal chasing to legal action once it becomes clear that obviously the tenant is not really engaging or making meaningful payments. Informal dialogue, I do support that is appropriate initially, but obviously delay can weaken recovery options down the line. So if rent remains unpaid after an initial reminder and a formal letter before action, and then a lot of tries from the landlord perspective to communicate with the tenant with no results, then landlords should already be considering other repayment routes. So now that said, I think early engagement is often more effective than immediate escalation. So understanding whether a tenant's issue is short-term or structural can help determine whether a payment plan or alternatively a temporary adjustment is commercially sensible. I think in some cases, working constructively with a tenant through short-term difficulties can ultimately protect income and asset value more effectively than, for instance, pursuing eviction at the first opportunity. Additionally, I think clear documentation of all discussions, agreements, reminders, and notices is essential throughout this process.
Once rent is missed, Emily, what early steps do you think landlords should take to protect their position and avoid weakening their legal position later?
I suppose the first legal step is a formal letter before action. So once you've gone through the process of understanding your tenant's situation and all the things that we've already discussed, you should act fairly promptly then in preparing a formal letter before action. That letter may, in certain circumstances, need to comply with the debt protocol. So, for example, if you're writing to an individual or a sole trader, you have to ensure that that letter complies with the various rules that the protocol provides. Certainly, whatever type of letter you're writing on a formal basis, it needs to very clearly set out what the rights and obligations are under the relevant document, so the lease or tenancy agreement. Set out clearly what the arrears are, so provide a detailed statement along with the letter. And also set a very clear deadline, and that's probably the most important because that sets the timetable then to take action once payment is still not made after that date. We've mentioned the sort of more informal steps that might be taken beforehand. Whilst important at that point, I would advise against relying solely on those kind of informal communications. The reason is that they can be misinterpreted if they're less formal. They can also be ignored perhaps more easily by a tenant rather than a formal letter before action coming from a firm of solicitors, for instance. Also, the courts will expect the landlord to have taken certain steps and, for example, comply with the relevant protocol, and informal communications may not simply comply with those requirements. The first step, of course, before even preparing the letter before action is to look very carefully at the lease itself. This might set out various options that a landlord may be able to pursue, and there may be other documents alongside the lease, such as guarantees and rent deposits. So it's important to understand whether, for instance, you have a forfeiture clause, so that might be an option for you to take back possession if arrears aren't paid. You might have an interest clause, very likely, in certainly commercial leases, and you may want to pursue that. But there may be steps you have to take in order to collect that interest.
So prevention and making sure that your agreement outlines everything it should.
Absolutely, at the outset, yes, having a good agreement in place obviously is hugely important. Also being careful at the very outset not to waive any rights that you might otherwise have. So the obvious one is forfeiture, which we'll come on to talk about in a bit more detail. But so getting your sort of legal advisor on board at an early stage, they can advise you what communications you can and can't have with your tenant before any formal action is taken.
Antonia, from your experience working with investors, what do you think are the early warning signs that just a small payment delay is about to turn into a much bigger problem if it's not dealt with immediately?
Common red flags include delayed or inconsistent responses from tenants, repeated promises to pay next week with no follow-through, requests for concessions without financial transparency, potentially reduced trading activity, or in cases where premises no longer operate, and then potentially where tenants prioritize other creditors than you as a landlord. When engagement drops off, in our experience, arrears rarely resolve themselves. So that's the point where we think investors need to act decisively. However, it's important to note here that landlords who maintain regular dialogue with the tenants often see warning signs earlier. From our experience at Consulco, as landlords ourselves, monitoring sector trends, economic conditions, interest rates, and tenant-specific news allow us to anticipate stress before any potential arrears arise. So in practice, checking in proactively with tenants can provide early visibility and allow potentially structured solutions before problems escalate.
So, Emily, many landlords are not aware that there is a big legal difference between commercial and residential arrears. Can you tell me in simple terms, what are the key differences that they need to know before even signing a lease?
They are very different characters indeed. Residential landlords or landlords of residential premises do face a lot more hurdles. There are a lot more rules and regulations that apply to residential property that they will have to comply with and overcome. As a result, generally, landlords of residential property will need a court order to take any action against their tenant and certainly possession. There are only a few exceptions to that. So, for example, with long residential leases, there are a whole host of requirements in even demanding, for example, service charges that your tenant may have to pay. You may have to consult with your tenants in relation to more costly works and provide certain information with the demands that you raise with your tenants in relation to service charges, for example. With the sort of short-term market lets, there are also requirements in terms of the way that you demand them and the way that you collect arrears and ultimately go for possession. And that's about to get even more difficult in a way post the 1st of May when we have the renters' rights regime kicking in. Whereas in contrast, landlords of commercial property Basically, it's what the lease says is what rights they have. So it's the contract between the landlord and the tenant that really the only thing that provides the constraints on that landlord. Also, with commercial property, landlords will often have more self-help remedies, for example. So they can, in certain circumstances, and providing they follow the rules, they can peaceably re-enter as a result of the arrears. They can physically take back possession without a court order. They may also, again, providing the correct notices are served, be able to use commercial rent recovery, or CRA as it's known, so removing goods from the premises to the value of the arrears. In both residential tenancies and commercial, you may well have guarantors or rent deposits as well. But again, in the field of residential properties, there will be more hurdles you have to overcome to rely on those additional rights and ways of enforcement than there will be with commercial. So it's really essential, as I say at the beginning, to understand the differences between the two. From the very outset, to understand which regimes apply to each, what you're dealing with, and then you can set your strategy depending upon what the best way is to deal with that. And also the time frames that will be quite different, because you will have so much more potentially to do when it comes to residential property.
For residential landlords specifically, what legal options are there to recover unpaid rent or take back their property? And how do they really work in practice?
Well, there's really two types of residential property that you may have in your portfolio. You'll have the long leasehold residential property. And with those type of leases, you will undoubtedly start with a letter before action, as we've said before. You're likely to have to comply with the protocol because you'll be writing to an individual most likely. And once you sent that and you've given this the requisite time frame in which for them to pay, if you haven't had payment at that point, then you can't simply go to straight for possession if that is what ultimately you want to get. You're going to have to get those arrears determined or agreed by the tenant. The chances are they won't be agreed, and so you may well have to issue court proceedings to get a judgment for those arrears. And once you have that, then you can move to possession as a means of enforcing that debt, with the warning that there is always a right for that lessee to apply for relief on payment. So at the very end of it, they can still make payment and save their property. With market lets, it's quite different. You may well start with a letter before action and then go simply to pursue the debt itself through county court proceedings. But most landlords with market lets, where you've got, say, monthly rents, you anticipate that the arrears are going to simply continue to accrue. So you are going to take steps to take back possession almost immediately. Until the 1st of May, it is possible to serve a Section 21 notice, which is a fairly swift procedure compared to the alternative of taking back possession. But that in itself doesn't give you the arrears. That is only to give you possession. More likely, and certainly the only option after the 1st of May, will be to serve a Section 8 notice. You will comply with the various grounds that are required to serve that notice based on the arrears. And then once, if payment has not been made and the notice period has expired, you will issue your possession proceedings. And then ultimately face whatever the court responds in that regard. In practice, it's very much a step-by-step process that you go through in recovering arrears and possession, and you just have to ensure that you're complying with each stage precisely and accurately. And the preparation is so important, and the record keeping of landlords needs to be accurate and available. The courts are always going to look more favourably at landlords that engage with their tenants, as we've discussed, try to avoid litigation if possible. But ultimately, if you can't secure the arrears or the possession at the end of the day by discussing things with your tenant, then you need to pursue formally.
Is it worth it for the landlord to keep a record of the interactions they try to have with their tenants? So to keep a log as an evidence, is this something that they use in court sometimes?
I think it can be useful in itself. As I say, you need to take formal steps to be able to recover possession. But you will find that a lot of tenants will seek to defend a possession claim for obvious reasons. And if they have a record of what they say was said to them, and you don't have any way of sort of countering that because you yourself haven't kept a record, that can pose a difficulty, particularly in the county courts that are so sort of tenant orientated. All the legislation is designed to protect the residential occupier. So yes, I would say it was prudent to keep those kind of records.
You have to be extra proactive as a landlord.
Yeah.
Right. So realistically, how long does the rent arrears and repossession process usually take from start to finish? And where do delays usually tend to happen?
So in a residential field, and to a certain extent in the commercial, although it can be a little quicker, you are talking about, potentially 6 to 12 months from start to finish. And that's not so much that the notice periods are particularly long. For example, a Section 8 notice, maybe only 2 weeks notice period. It's all the other reasons why the process sort of is delayed. So delays can commonly arise from the fact that there are potentially errors in the original notices that are served, or that some of the sort of requirements aren't met at the outset. And unfortunately, that sometimes isn't discovered until much further down the line. For example, actually when you're in court, and of course that means starting from the very beginning again. But the court process itself takes time, and that's simply because the court has such a backlog of these type of claims, is generally quite under-resourced, and so you just have to wait your turn, and that can be several months down the line. Tenants, as I say, often raise defences, because particularly in residential property, and even when that defence has no merit, the court will have to consider it and give the opportunity to the tenant to have its say, so to speak. So that in itself can cause delays in ultimately getting possession. You will often find tenants do propose payment plans, which can be a good thing as a means of trying to resolve it. But that often involves then a bit of negotiation back and forth to find the right figure that's commercially acceptable to the landlord. And the court will probably give a tenant time in which to try and negotiate a deal. And so that in itself can then lead to further delays.
Do these deals usually work out well? Payment plans as such?
We would encourage landlords to seriously consider payment plans, but to document them carefully. Because you do want something that says, if there is any default, the whole amount falls due and the enforcement action can continue. So yes, it is a means of avoiding obviously the costs of litigation and the time that we're talking about that these things take. And then ultimately, when you even have your possession order for arrears, you've then, if the tenant doesn't vacate in a residential field in particular, you've got to wait for a county court bailiff, and that can in itself take several months, being that there are so few bailiffs available generally, particularly in central London, unfortunately.
Okay, so it's usually the waiting is around a couple of months?
At least, if not more.
So you mentioned before that commercial landlords often have more enforcement power. Apart from going to court, what options do they have? And when might forfeiture, CRAR, or guarantor options be appropriate?
So yes, other than, as you say, going down the court process, commercial landlords have what are known as these self-help remedies, for instance. So starting with CRAR, first of all. So this is a matter of a commercial rent arrears recovery process where you serve notice on your tenant, and then the sort of authorised agents or bailiffs can go in and remove goods to the value of that. We'll come on to sort of circumstances that may be effective. Forfeiture, again, with commercial, providing you have the right in your lease. So at the outset, very important to consider what is in your lease or tenancy agreement. You can potentially peaceably re-enter, so take back possession. Although that in itself doesn't get you the arrears, you would then have to pursue them separately. There may be guarantee agreements, both in the context of residential or commercial, There will be a process you have to go through to be able to demand the arrears from that guarantor, but it might be a better option than the tenant itself, especially if your initial knowledge of your tenant appreciates that they themselves are in financial difficulties. The guarantor may be the best option for you. We've also got statutory demands, so this is a sort of the first step of making a tenant either insolvent or bankrupt. They are quite effective if you believe that your tenant would be greatly concerned by having a statutory demand served upon them. That in itself may elicit payment, but there is quite a long process then to go through if ultimately you are intending to actually bankrupt or wind up the tenant company. So it is a matter of thinking strategically which option is the best. And when we talked about CRA, effective, but if the premises are empty, or if the premises only have goods that are, not of great value, ultimately you're not going to secure your debt and you're going to have gone through the process and the costs incurred in doing that, but not get the money at the end of the day. Forfeiture is a very draconian remedy that is only given to landlords, and so it is heavily protected by the courts if you make any mistake. So it's very easy to waive your right to do so, and so that means careful monitoring of the sort of conversations and communications you've had with your tenant, your point about keeping a record of them. But ultimately, it will get you back the property, but there is always this right to the tenant then to claim relief, so it might not be the end of the matter at the end of the day.
And the potential then demands of the rents when it comes to forfeiture and not waiving your right to forfeit.
Then you have the court process, which is your option for debt recovery. If some of the self-help remedies aren't going to, you think, work strategically. And that is a lengthy process, even just to get a debt order out of the court. But then again, you might have to follow through with enforcement action after that, and that will depend. It always depends on whether the tenant has the money at the end of the day to pay the debt off.
Antonia, how should landlords decide how far to go in pursuing arrears, considering they have to balance the expenses, the time it takes, any reputational impact, and how likely recovery really is?
So it's never just only about the legal rights. And as Emily mentioned, it's also about commercial judgment and the interaction you have with the tenants. Landlords should consider, among others, whether the tenant is solvent, whether there are assets or guarantees to recover against, if enforcement will potentially damage long-term assets, and then the value of those assets, and whether the tenant's difficulty is temporary or potentially structural. I think market conditions remain challenging across many sectors, and landlords who work constructively with their tenants during difficult periods may ultimately protect both income streams and asset performance. Also, from our experience, I think sometimes swift enforcement is the right move. And then other times, restraint preserves value. I think the key is having a clear strategy rather than reacting sporadically.
Antonia, with all the challenges around rent arrears, what approaches have you found work best for helping international property owners deal with them?
Drawing our experience at Consulco as both asset managers and landlords, we adopt a proactive and structured approach focused on mainly risk identification, engagement, and protection of long-term value, as I mentioned before. So early monitoring is key in our experience. Tracking payment patterns, tenant performance, and market conditions allows potential arrears issues to be identified before they escalate. Where concerns arise, consistent and professional engagement with the tenants helps clarify potential circumstances and often leads to practical, commercially sensible solutions. We also prioritize clear documentation of all communication and agreements because, as you both mentioned before, this is increasingly important. And then ensuring legal rights are preserved and enforcement options remains available is extremely important and is required, especially for us as landlords. For international owners, strategies must be tailored to local legal frameworks and asset types, recognizing that commercial and residential properties operate under different rules across jurisdictions. And I think ultimately effective arrears management requires balancing legal compliance with commercial judgment, as Emily also mentioned previously. And we think by combining early intervention, structured procedures and processes, and forward-looking risk mitigation, such as strong lease terms and appropriate security, then landlords can definitely minimize disputes while protecting income and asset value.
Emily, Antonia, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today and really for helping us make sense of what can be a pretty tricky topic.
Thank you so much, Isabella.
Thank you.